welcome the host of Epic this week, Mr. Nick Redfern.
Thank you all for joining us on Epic Voyages. I'm Nick Redfern, your host this evening. My guest is Gary Heseltine. And Gary is probably one of our most intriguing guests on the show, chiefly because of his background. Gary runs what's called the PRUFOS Police Database, PRUFOS, which you can find at prufospolicedatabase.co.uk. And Gary is a retired detective constable with the British Transport Police. He served with them from 1989 to 2013, and prior to that, served with the British Royal Air Force. And Gary has chiefly focused his UFO research on what the British Police Force knows about the subject and reports and encounters involving British police officers. And to date, his database goes back to 1901 and more than 400 reports involving more than 900 officers. And it's accurate to say that there's really nobody else in the UK who's doing this kind of in-depth research into such a specific field. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Gary to the show and to the guests. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you for having me as a guest.
Oh, you're very welcome, Gary. I'm kind of like you because I do guest hosting on the show and you're the guest. So we're sort of both here, I guess, sort of on occasion, so to speak. But thanks again for coming on the show. And before we sort of get to, sort of the meat of the work that you do in terms of the UFO field, can you sort of give a bit of background, a bit more expanded background on your research and, who you are, etc.?
I'm 53. I'm married. I have 2 adult children from previous relationships. I was a police officer for nearly 24 years, like you said in your introduction. Of that 24 years, I was a detective constable for about 20 years. I was an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses. I also did some training on interviewing as well. I began my serious UFO research in January 2002 when I launched the PRUFOS Police Database, PRUFOS being the acronym for Police Reporting UFO Sightings. And that launched with an article in the then famous publication by Graham Birdsall, which you'll know him very well, Graham Birdsall, in January 2002. So that was the first issue. That's when I launched it, and straight away there was a response of officers, mainly retired initially, and it just carried on from there, really. I started with half a dozen cases involving about 10 officers, and like you've just quoted accurately now, 11 years later, over 400 cases, and I think the last total is about 940 British police officers. So it's increased exponentially, much more than I ever imagined.
All right, cool. Now, didn't you have your own encounter that sort of, initially at least, prompted interest in these subjects, when that occurred?
Yeah, my interest stems from a childhood sighting when I was 15 in Scunthorpe, which is in Lincolnshire in England, my hometown, or actually in the suburb of Ashby in Scunthorpe. And I was with my then girlfriend. We were walking home. It was a balmy August night. I'm not sure the exact date, but it was during the summer holidays between schools, as it were. And there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was one of those few nights in England where there's no cloud, there's no wind, and you just get a load of stars out, which isn't very often. And as we were walking along a very dark, narrow footpath with what you would say in the States, high school fields on my left, and a large gardening allotment, as we would say in England, on our right, we suddenly saw all that I can describe as a bright white light. There was no distinct shape, but it was odd. It was bigger than the stars. It was about a 60-degree angle, and it moved from our right to left, and it seemed to be very odd. It didn't make any noise. We watched it, and the strange thing was that as soon as it went in front of us, if you can imagine the pathway ahead of you, it then passed over us, right to left, and basically all the housing in the distance from behind it was cut off in like a power cut. The whole area went into darkness. That frightened my then girlfriend, rightly or wrongly. I had my cycle with my bicycle at the time with me, so I said, get on the bike and I will ride you quickly to your home. That's what I did. I dropped her off. Her house was in total darkness. Everybody was getting candles out. The object was heading in the general direction of my home very slowly. And so I thought, well, if I get back on my bike and maybe take a shortcut, I can maybe get ahead of the light as it approaches my home. And that's exactly what I did. I went down the same alleyway. I rode light as fast as I could go, then rode about a mile really fast down a long straight road called Grange Lane South. And I remember a very strange experience of moving from total darkness at the point of a corner where Grange Lane South turned to the left in my direction. It was moving to the left, and I could see that the electricity was on in the distance beyond the corner, and yet I was going from total darkness and then into total light. And I remember getting to the corner, looking over my right shoulder, and by this time I was ahead of the light slightly. It was over my right shoulder, and basically what I did was I went around two more corners, dropped the bike outside my front door of my house, semi-detached house, rushed into the living room and said to my parents who were having a cup of tea, as English people do, about 8, 9 o'clock, and I said, come outside, I think there's going to be a power cut caused by this strange light. They just looked at me bemused, as you would, and basically then they didn't follow me, so I ran through the hall, ran through the kitchen, out through the back door, into the garden, turned around to look back at facing my house, just in time to see the object now moving over my rooftop. I put my arm up directly above my head, and as soon as the object went beyond me, and so therefore I was behind it, guess what? There was a power cut. And it's at that point there that I realised that light must have, in some way, from having moved to a second geographical position, that somehow interacted with a power grid. And there you have it. I had no interest in the subject up to that point.
Wow. And did that sort of get you involved in doing research, or was it like, a case you started to read books and things like that on the subject?
Well, 1975, as you probably well remember, there wasn't really a lot. It was just prior to the Betamax and VHS era, and really all I could do was get second-hand books, and that's exactly what I did. And fortunately, the first book that I got, and I kind of look back at it and think that there's maybe some kind of synchronicity in this, was a book by Donald Kehoe, Major Don Kehoe, who was one of my heroes. One of his 5 books, Aliens Are Real, and straight away I was hearing about pilots chasing UFOs. So to me, it kind of reinforced that I'd seen something very strange. I remember for a time, that's all I did. I just got books. And then I actually joined Bufora for a year as an associate member. And I think I had that for a couple of years, but I never did any research. I went to a local UFO group, but that didn't really appeal to me. So in terms of active research, I didn't actually do anything other than read books. I remember once opening the Scunthorpe Film Theatre, and at 18 years of age, which is a bit bizarre really, having the confidence to stand in front of about 200 people in this new film theatre auditorium and introducing some famous UFO clips. The Montana and the Tremonton shots for a UFO conference. But aside from that, I didn't really do any active research until launching the database. But it was really about the mid-1990s when I came across Graham Burt's UFO magazine that reawakened my interest. So 17, 18 years later, by which time I'd been in the Air Force, I'd joined the police, I'd had a family, had children, so I'd gone away and had a life. And it was really only in the mid-90s when I came across that magazine that it reawakened my interest. And strangely, you're involved in that, Nick, because it's for you to. It's your fault, actually. I think. But basically, when I'd been away from the subject for a long time, and I reacquainted myself with all the modern books in the 90s. And, of course, there was Above Top Secret by Tim Good, Beyond Top Secret. And, of course, there was A Covert Agenda by Your Good Self, which is still one of the best books ever written. So well done on that. And I was hooked ever since. And gradually, as the time wore on, I felt myself being drawn into wanting to get involved in some capacity.
Okay. So I guess would it be sort of fair to say a lot of it was the fact that, Graham and the magazine, it was like a like-minded community or whatever, and you wanted to get involved with it and stuff?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't forget, I was a police officer. 1990s, I was 1995 when I came across the magazine. I was a police officer for 6 years at that point, and I was already a detective. So I was looking at things through evidential eyes, and what has always impressed me about the subject, and it is a very complicated subject, but what has always impressed me have been the pilot reports, because I really don't see if you can get better than a pilot chasing a UFO or opening fire at a UFO kind of thing. And those cases exist, and the public don't get to hear about them very often. And so when I read his magazine, which wasn't sensationalistic, it looked at it from a common sense point of view. It was a like mine, but what a coincidence that at that time, when I started to really get interested, he was only based at Ilkley. Which was where I worked in Leeds. I mean, if he'd have been based in Kent, I'd have never met him. I wouldn't have gone to the trouble. So it was all kind of weird, really, that it all kind of fell into my lap, as it were, that I could make contact and get to know him in the last couple of years before he died.
Oh, cool, like it was meant to be almost.
Oh, yeah, it is quite bizarre. I mean, I'm not religious in any way, but if anybody had said that 15 years ago that I'd be talking at the National Press Club where Gorbachev, Reagan, all the presidents have spoken, Nelson Mandela's spoken, I'd have laughed at them because it's bizarre, but, who knows?
Yeah, no, that's right. And when you sort of began to put the database together, I mean, what was the first step? I mean, because it's not every day that anyone, never mind a police officer, sits down and says, I'm going to put together a database of police UFO reports. How did you sort of go about it and, I guess, collate and collect the data and get the word out, etc., as to what you were doing?
Well, what happened was, we're missing little bits out, but cutting to the chase, effectively what happened, when I had the idea for the database, I immediately thought of Graham Birdsall as being the avenue to get the publicity that it needed to the UFO community. Now, bear in mind, I'd never written anything in my life at that point, but when that happened, I had the idea that I went to see him, by which time he'd moved actually closer to where I lived, but he was based at Sturton, which was like an industrial complex just outside Leeds, and it was actually on my patch, as it were. So I would call him for a cup of tea. So I'd got to know him, and I had the idea, and he said, well, you're a credible source, a police officer.